Welcome back to Football Unspoken. So, Josh, this week we're going to be talking about Italy and the Italian league. But before we jump into that, I have a very financially based, interesting question for you around Serie A. Can you give me a ballpark, but can you let me know how much the league lost due to COVID pandemic in 2021 and 2020 and 2021?
Oh, in millions, obviously. Uh, I'm gonna say, and that's in the 1 year period, right, of the season.
In the 1 year period, how much do you think they lost?
I reckon they lost about 200 million.
You're so far off. You're so far off. It is 1.4 billion. 1.4 billion euros. And I think that just kind of shows where Italian football is. And this leads me into my question, which is we've obviously seen a decline in Serie A, and it's become a bit of a, unfortunately, a bit of a joke league in Europe. But do you think that we'll ever see the comeback of Serie A, and what needs to happen to allow that to happen?
It's pretty harsh to say that the Serie A has fallen. So when you look at the numbers financially, I think it's kind of obvious that Serie A has fallen away. But actually, when you look at their European performances from Italy, I think it's incredibly harsh to say that Italy's fallen away. And I know this is actually quite a popular narrative because if you look at 2 seasons ago, I'm pretty certain Italy had a team in the final of the Europa, the Champions League, and the conference. They had a team, I think it was Fiorentina. So Inter was in the Champions League. I think Fiorentina was Europa, and they had Roma. That was that final, I believe, with Jose Mourinho, and he was fighting the referees and whatever. So they literally had an Italian team in all European finals 2 seasons ago. And the season before, they also had I think they had all seven Italian teams or something, all seven teams that were in Europe all made it to the knockouts of the European competitions. So you can make arguments about whether that's an achievement or not. And because of that, didn't Italy have the highest coefficient in Europe, meaning that they were one of the only teams in Europe to get the five Champions League spots? So I think it's incredibly harsh for it. It's a tough one because if you talk about this a lot, you say people simply look at the stats and then they build a story off the stats and they don't look at external values or whatever that actually can tell the story. And I think from my perspective, Italy is one of those situations where when you just look at the plain numbers, how much money's been lost and whatever, it's like, oh, the league shrunk. And with all logical how we analyze numbers, it should have shrunk significantly. But the performances are still there in Europe and stuff. And that's why we need to ultimately measure a league, to be honest. So when we talk about farmers league, like the French league, oh, it's a farmers league and whatever, I think we can somewhat say that regardless of the numbers, because besides PSG, how do the other French teams tend to perform? I was actually looking at it was either the Conference or the Europa League literally this week, and Nice, whichever one they're in, they're pretty much bottom and they haven't won a game, I don't think, out of 5 or 6 games. And that's kind of what I mean. Regardless whether it's Europa or Conference, a French team that's qualified for Europa should be, when I say competitive in the group stages of that division, they should be coming somewhere mid-table, easily qualifying for the playoff stage, but they're not. They're getting hammered. And now that's a sample size of one. But I'm just saying, with Italy, that's not the case. All of those teams just qualify pretty comfortably for the next stages of those European competitions, whether the money is coming up or down. So I'm I'm actually not on the boat of saying the Italian league has collapsed altogether.
That's really interesting, actually. I didn't think you'd have that take. To be entirely honest, I think it's one of those where when I look at it, I think the problem is that I look back to those AC Milan teams of old, with Kaká and um, Maldini and those types of players, and you look at the Italian league and who are the superstars in those leagues. Dybala was considered one of the best players in that league for years, but consistently underperformed in my mind. And I'm not sure if maybe I just wasn't on the side of the media where they were talking bad about Dybala, but I never heard that. And I do get what you're saying around the European performances. Obviously, that's where you measure a team's success or a league's success. But I think there's also something to be said about the consistency of Italy in terms of these leagues and in general. Like you'll every now and then you get a Roma come through and pull out a great season. Juventus will come through, pull out a great season. But what sets the leagues apart is the consistent basis on which they're able to do it. In Spain is considered still, I would probably, in terms of Europe, say they're still the best league in Europe. Maybe not as a league, but in terms of the teams that they produce, they consistently win and challenge in European finals and as well as nationally, the Euro Championships, at the World Cups, they're consistently up there. Whereas Italy, as a national team, have gone from a situation where they won the Euros and then they didn't qualify for the World Cup. Like it's not sure how you kind of how that swings so much in 2 years. It's a very interesting situation. And then also being able to attract superstar players is a big teller of where your league is. The Premier League is considered the best league because almost every player at some point goes, I would love to try the Premier League. I want to go to the Premier League. I want to see what the Premier League's about. Similarly with La Liga, but there's not many players nowadays that go, I want to go to AC Milan. I want to go to Italy. And the one thing I would say about it is a big thing is that a lot of Premier League players who were bench players and not really doing well in the Premier League often go to Italy and end up tearing it up. And I can't see how you can be considered an on-par league when our backups are going over to Italy and doing better.
Hey, you've drawn me in here, that last comment. I'd love to say about some of your other pieces, which I'll come back to. But on that, I'm not sure that's a completely fair valuation. You look at Jadon Sancho going off to Dortmund and he tore it up there, went to Manchester United, did terribly. I know that can be a manager fit, and then goes back to Dortmund 6 months, tears it up again. So from my perspective, I'm not sure that's necessarily an argument, but bring it back to where that falls in line with Serie A. I think the problem with numbers like this, financial numbers or whatever, we're all done in hindsight. As in you go, oh, in the last 5 years, Italy's been dropping in revenue numbers, like the Serie A have been dropping in revenue numbers and wages have been having to drop, etc. in line with that. But then we're talking about that drop happening 5 years ago, starting 5 years ago. Those teams, for the last 5-10 years, they've been really good. The Italian team, they're constructing a team. And what I mean about that is kind of what you're talking about, having less superstars in the squad and a better team around them. And that's how they've been able to compete still in Europe while having much smaller wage budgets compared to the other leagues, or being able to bring in less superstar players. And funny enough, an example of that actually is when Ronaldo went to Juventus. So he went to Juventus and it worked out from the perspective he still scored all the Ronaldo goals and all that, but there was a lot of murmuring of it didn't just quite click with the team, as in this idea of you have your focal point in a team is not something that is, I'd say, it's a foreign concept to the Italian league now. They like doing this whole thing of what you would find of talking about players who are failing in the Premier League or La Liga. They go buy them on the cheap. You think of Mkhitaryan leaving Arsenal to go to, I think he went to Inter first, and then he's gone off to Roma and some of the other teams. That's what the Italians love. They love a deal and getting a player in who's being accused of not living up to the hype and bringing him into a system where he can perform and getting the most out of him. So they masters at bargains, I would say, in the Italian league, and they're really good at building a team around that. But I can see the consequence of that is it's kind of like, in football, when you go out with a defensive mentality and you're like, right, boys, we're going to try to scrape a 1-0 win today. We've got to keep it tight. And you concede in 2 minutes into the game. And now you're like, oh, this is really bad. What are we going to do to rectify the situation? Because the whole plan's gone out the window. I can see that risk with the Italian teams of, if something goes wrong and they actually have to spend the money now, some urgency comes into it, they literally can't. They have no room or wiggle room to work with, where you always see that with Premier League teams, that they get themselves into all sorts of situations and they just come January or whatever, they just buy their way out of it. That's why I think it was for a season or two, we had that rule change for the transfer windows where the transfer window ended as the season started or something like that. In the Premier League, I believe that's gone away now again. But the reason that argument was put in place was because people were saying, "Oh, the Premier League teams play their first game or two, realize they're in trouble, they're not going to achieve their goals, and then they just splash another 100 million before the window can end." Where the Italian teams don't have that luxury in terms of finances, so that's forced them to go down this route of building more teams than individuals. But it also keeps them on this really thin layer of ice, where if they don't get it right, they're just not just screwed for that season; they're probably screwed for the next few seasons now.
Yeah, I can definitely see what you mean, especially around the being able to build teams. Because even when they did have those star players in there, you looked at those star teams and they played as a team. Like, that was the big thing. You weren't looking at Ronaldo's a great example. Like when Ronaldo was at Man United, it was a situation of like the team sort of seemed to play for Ronaldo. And obviously, you kind of need to do that when you have a great player. You need to be able to build around them. But what Italian teams seem to be able to do better than most other teams is build around, if they do get a star player, they can build around them to a point where all the other players look just as good, you know? And the other side of it with Italy, and this is why I would say, this is why I said, what do you think needs to happen to improve their situation? And what I mean by that is Italy have some of the most loyal fan bases as well as some of the most loyal players. You think about your top players who didn't really move clubs around. You know, you had your Gianluigi Buffons, your Tottis, these kind of players who didn't really want to move around too much. They enjoyed their club, they stayed with their club, and they were like a family. The club was part of an extended family. And that is something I think Italy needs to really, really lean into. Try and get that family element into it and not exploit. I don't want to talk about exploiting loyalty by raising prices and all that kind of stuff, but try and create a situation where that club loyalty spills further out than your local town. In Roma have some of the most loyal fans and players, but outside of Italy, you don't see too many Roma t-shirts, you know?
They also had a huge amount of football history because there was a time, literally the biggest league in the world before the Premier League became the Premier League. It was Serie A. That was the biggest league in the world and the most well known with the star players that you refer to. That was almost the first football revolution, if you like, in Europe of like a big league that everyone was watching was Serie A originally. So they still have all of that football history to play on. And we know that's actually a big component of the Premier League. Like why the big sixes, you in separate conversations, you made this point to me. This concept of the big six in the Premier League doesn't inherently make a lot of sense. If you look at who finishes top six every year, it's pretty much never the top six. If you look at year in year out in terms of exactly those six, but the point is because of the football history those clubs have, it's just it's the big six. And Serie A has that benefit as well when you've got AC and Inter and Juventus, but now you've also got Atlanta in the mix, who are a big club in their own right. I just mean they wouldn't be considered, say, the big four of Italy or something. Like you got Lazio, who hasn't been performing as well in recent years, but again, big name in Europe. So they've got that base to work off where a lot of other leagues don't. Like if I said to you, you got 30 seconds, maybe you with some advanced football knowledge would be able to get this. But I say you got 30 seconds, name me as many Bundesliga's teams you could. After Dortmund, Bayern, and Leipzig, how many are you getting? You know what I mean? I think you would get more from Italy than you would from Germany. And most football fans, even if they only started watching in the last 5 years, I would bet they would get more teams from Italy than they would from Germany and even debatably Spain. So Spain, you got like a top three there in Real Madrid, Atletico, and Barca that people would name off the bat. And then it'd be interesting to see could people name more from Italy or Spain.
Yeah, that's exactly what I mean. They have like the history, they have the ability to kind of transfer that into more off the field success. Because I will say, you managed to convince me. You've swung me around from this idea of Serie A being the Serie B of Europe. So you've swung me around because yeah, they still have the teams that perform, and they're still interesting to watch. But I think their off field struggles are such a problem to their long-term success as a league and as a footballing nation as well, because the problem that you're going to run into, and we know this coming from South Africa, like realistically, more kids nowadays in South Africa are more interested in rugby than in football, because rugby is what the successful sport is. And if Italy keep going down this route of not qualifying for World Cups and not qualifying for Euros and having only fairly marginal success, people are going to turn to different sports because they want to watch a team be successful. But I think this has been overall very interesting. You've definitely swung me around, and I'd love to see if Serie A can come out of this financial slump rather than on-field slump that they've run into. And on that point, I'd also love to hear your thoughts on this, guys. If you have any thoughts, is Serie A as good as it always was, or are there aspects that really, really need to improve? And also let us know if there's any other topics you'd like to hear us discuss, or if you just want to discuss with us. It'd be great to hear from you. So leave a comment, leave a like, and see you next time.